Good morning everyone, welcome to Learn with Lorna number 126, where we'll be looking at stories from Raasay. I'll wait for a second for people to join us. The constant competition to see who says hello first. You'll see, as it's the 1st of December, if you've been watching me for a couple of years, you'll see that I've pulled out the Christmas jumper, which I always do. It's actually far too warm for Christmas jumpers this year for some reason, so it'll be coming off after I finish the broadcast, but at least it's on to keep up the tradition of Christmas jumpers for December. So welcome to Learn with Lorna. For those of you who have never watched before, this is a series designed to share the collections of the Highland Archive Service to you wherever you are watching. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn and I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the service. The Highland Archive Service, as you'll know if you've been watching a while, has 4 centres across the Highlands of Scotland where we look after historic documents relating to this part of the world. So we have an office in Inverness, one in Wick, one in Portree and one in Fort William. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But as I always say, if you're able to donate towards our work, if you're in a position to do so, then we're very grateful for that. So, morning everyone, lots of people saying hello. I think Penny, you got in first. Hello. Okay, so this week is the delayed episode that I had to postpone when I was collapsing with laryngitis. Stories from Raasay, or Raasay, which is the Gaelic, meaning the Isle of the Roe Deer. Raasay, I'm sure, will be familiar to many of you, particularly if you're in Scotland. It's an island that sits between mainland Scotland and the Isle of Skye. The sound of Raasay sits between Raasay and Skye, and the inner sound between Raasay and the mainland around Applecross. So of course we're looking at the west coast of Scotland, a west coast island, and of course then, thanks for this, some notes on this go to my colleague Catherine in Skye and Lochalsh. Between 1845 and 1975, some key dates that you'll maybe remember: local government reform. When that local government reform 1975 ended the parish and borough and county system. Prior to that date, the island of Raasay was part of the parish of Portree and the county of Inverness-shire. It's famous for several things, but perhaps most notably for the birth of Sorley MacLean, the poet from the Scottish Renaissance, and I'll touch on Sorley MacLean a bit later. When I was asking Catherine for some thoughts about this episode, she said to me, "Raasay is far from being a carbon copy of Skye in microcosm. It has a history of its own, forged by its own unique attributes. Archaeology gives us traces of occupation since the last ice age, the first surviving records written in the 16th century, when the MacLeods of Raasay were believed to have received the island from the MacLeods of Lewis. For many years, the lands of Raasay and the nearby island of Rona were held by the Bishop of the Isles as a representative of the Church, and from the 15th century onwards by the MacLeods of Raasay as the tenants. The 1587 Act of Annexation transferred the ownership of all church lands to the Crown, and the MacLeods retained control of Raasay. The Raasay records that we hold at Skye and Lochalsh Archives date from 1607 through to 1980. The MacLeod lairds kept Raasay until 1843, when it fell into the hands of creditors. 1843, you may remember, is a key year in Scottish history, the year of the disruption and the formation of the Free Church. And this is referenced in this extract from the second statistical account for the parish of Portree, which includes Raasay at this point. As I've said before, when I'm looking at statistical accounts, they are fantastic, they're full of information, they're sometimes quite funny, they're full of useful information. You have to also remember the context that they were written in, and although people are trying to be kind, they're sometimes quite patronising. See what you think of this one. So this is the minister writing about the people of Portree, the parish of Portree, including Raasay. Character of the people. They are powerfully under the influence of moral principle. So much so indeed that heinous crimes are seldom or ever seen or heard of among them. They are attached to their superiors, obedient to the law, dutiful and loyal to their sovereign, charitable to the poor and hospitable to strangers. They are all of the established Church of Scotland and firmly attached to her constitution, worship and doctrine. So inviolable is their attachment that lately some of them, hearing of the disputes which at this moment unfortunately disturb and agitate our venerable Church, and dreading that these arose from the ascendancy and hostility of Roman Catholic or other sectarians, were heard solemnly to declare in the presence of the writer of these pages that sooner than the Church of their fathers should suffer violence or change, and far less annihilation, they would suffer their heads to be cut off. So they're saying all that's happening around the disruption and the creation of the Free Church is so worrying to them because they're such loyal devotees of the Church of Scotland, which is quite interesting considering we associate the Western Isles with the Free Church. They go on to say, but with all their admirable mental qualifications, they labour here under the greatest poverty, which never fails to carry along with it many disadvantages and many evils. And certainly the want of cleanliness is not the least of these. From the great scarcity of timber, there being none fit for use of growing in place, and utter inability of the people to purchase and import wood, they are much at a loss for the necessary accommodation with regard to dwelling and other houses. The poor tenants are almost invariably under the necessity of having cattle under the same roof as themselves, without partition, without division, and without a chimney. Their houses therefore are smoky and filthy in the extreme, and having little either of night or day clothing, and their children nearly approaching to absolute nakedness, they are fully as much without cleanliness in their persons as they are in their houses. No people on earth live more simple or scanty diet than those in this parish. The greater number of them subsist on potatoes of the worst kind, sometimes with, but more often without, fish. The language generally spoken in this parish is Gaelic. From the facility of intercourse with the Low Country by means of steam navigation and parliamentary roads, the people have acquired a taste for the English language and are desirous of learning it. So quite a lot in that around the people, around the poverty, around some of the difficulties faced in that area. And you get a sense, I think, of the idea of the hardiness and strength of the people. And Kathleen, I see you're watching from Raasay, so maybe you can confirm if the people of Raasay are still hardy. It was in 1846 that the Raasay estate was bought by George Rainey. He was a merchant who had made his money in Demerara, in the Caribbean, and he owned large numbers of slaves in the Caribbean. Rainey was the son of Reverend George Rainey, who was the minister of Creech Parish in Sutherland. Now, as you will have heard me mention many times before, the go-to resource for anyone with an interest in the Highland connection to the Caribbean slave economy is David Alston's website and book, Slaves and Highlanders. I went there to check what the entry for Rainey said. And George and his brother Gilbert are detailed there, and this is what George's entry says. Gilbert's younger brother George, so this is the George who bought Raasay, was in Demerara by 1808 and later became a partner in the Liverpool firm which from 1813 would be known as Sandbach Tin & Co. They traded with and had property in Demerara. George acted on their behalf in Demerara between 1828 and 1832. It goes on to say that George Rainey returned to Britain, lived in London and was married 3 times. At emancipation, he was the primary claimant for over £50,000 of compensation for over 1,000 slaves, and a secondary claimant on a number of other properties. In 1845, George Rainey bought the island of Raasay, where he later evicted many of the tenants. One of his policies in Raasay was to forbid his tenants to marry, a measure of control reminiscent of the slave plantations. And somebody asked at the time, the evidence of it was given to the Napier Commission, which I'll come back to, what became of those people? And he says, Donald MacLeod, who was crofter, aged 78, who was giving evidence to the Napier Commission, he said, the people went to other kingdoms. Some went to America, some to Australia, and to other places that they could think of. Mr. Rainey enacted a rule that no one should marry on the island. There was one man there who married in spite of him, and because he did so, he was put out of his father's house, and that man went to a bothy, to a sheepcot. Mr. Rainey then came and demolished that upon him, extinguished his fire, and neither friend nor anyone else dared give him a night's shelter. He was not allowed entrance into any house. George Rainey died in 1863, and the legacy of the Rainey years are still felt, and I can see, Joanna, your comment there that Rainey is still a swear word in Raasay. Dr. Ian McKinnon and Dr. Andrew McKillop, their paper Plantation Slavery and Land Ownership in the West Highlands and Islands, Legacies and Lessons, describes how extraordinary it is that to consider that a minister's son could have made such a fortune and played such a huge role, and the role that that slave compensation fund played in that. I've spoken before, of course, about the Slave Compensation Act and the fact that in 1833 anyone who owned slaves at the point of abolition the owners were paid compensation for the loss of earnings of their slaves being freed. And this is what Dr. McKinnon and Dr. McKillop had put in their paper. Within 5 years of the establishment of the Slavery Compensation Fund, at least 8 former slave owners enriched by the fund had bought estates. However, money from the fund may also have been used for later purchases, with compensation being initially channeled into investments elsewhere in the domestic or imperial economy until a suitable estate became available. It is hard to conceive how someone like George Rainey, from a relatively modest background, the son of a minister in Sutherland, but who had received more than £50,000 in compensation, could otherwise have bought the island of Raasay for £27,000 in 1846. If you're interested in finding out more about the Highland connection to slavery and that compensation scheme, Learn with Lorna episode 25, Elizabeth McDermott in Jamaica tells the story of families who were involved in that and what that Compensation Act meant. Now, when I read out that extract there from David Alston's Slaves and Highlanders, it also it included a piece of evidence that I shared with you given by Donald MacLeod to the Napier Commission in 1883. The Napier Commission came about very simply as a response to crofting uprisings by crofters who weren't able to access their traditional lands. If you want to know more about that in more detail, Learn with Lorna 28 focuses on that. In that, Donald referred in that quote to the people leaving Raasay for other kingdoms under George Rainey's ownership. Many were evicted, some left voluntarily. And it's interesting to note that the second statistical account that I shared at the very beginning with those characters of the people, that they reference in that the movement of people from Skye and Raasay is also noted there, which is just before Rainey took over. And this is how it's described. It is, however, perfectly evident that no liberality on the part of proprietors can render the present immense surplus population in any measure comfortable. So there's far too many people to live comfortably. There is, humanly speaking, no other way to provide for them than by emigration. Though certainly it would be forever a matter of deep regret that so noble a race of men should be under the necessity of leaving their native land and seeking an asylum in a foreign shore. But as they are unable to effect this by any means within their own reach, they should be conveyed to any British settlement which may be thought eligible, all the expense defrayed, and lands provided for them in their adopted settlement by the government of that country. It's really interesting to look at a contemporary record of something that we know happened in such huge numbers. And also that touches on a common misconception, I think, that people have this image of the Highlands and Islands being empty and huge swathes of land with no people in them, and that absolutely has not always been the case. We have had times of overcrowding and mass population that have caused their own issues. During Rainey's time owning Raasay, it was a long period of time, and we hold the Raasay estate records covering this time period at Skye and Lochalsh, and it includes a document which, when it was given to us, was entitled a weather log. It dates from 1851 to 1869. It's a small, fascinating ledger, and one of the reasons it's so interesting is it includes things as juxtaposed as the first cuckoo call of 1853 and the number of yachts passing by the bay, alongside letters from those who are being forced to emigrate to Australia in 1852. The estate's butler has noted in this book social events, the comings and goings of boats, changes in the weather, the activities of the estate owner, the family and the staff, but also alongside that and just slotted in between, references to doctors and ministers and others coming to visit those who are emigrating to do medical assessments or inoculations or speak with them as they're preparing to leave their home. I'll share some extracts with you from this volume, some that Catherine sent over to me, detailing emigration to Australia in 1851-52 and revealing the names of some of the people who were involved in that movement of people. So for instance, Harry MacDonald, the factor of the estate, the person running the estate, Dr. MacLeod, who did those medical checks and inoculations, and also who was responsible for visiting the people in Ferns when they had a typhoid outbreak. So this is a few extracts from this volume, just to show the real difference between the entries. So 1851, Tuesday the 1st, April 1851, 10 p.m, boat not home from Portree, Mr. Finlayson, JCM of Stornoway, and Mr. MacDonald, Inspector of Gaelic, called. So, something normal. Thursday the 3rd, the Marquess of Staffordshire has passed Raasay. So just references to boats coming and going. Thursday the 7th of August, a yacht returned at 10:15 p.m. with Mr. and Mrs. Rainey and Sheriff Fraser. Friday the 22nd, 11 fresh salmon taken at the bay, 6 sent to Portree. So things that you can see, just general notes. Wednesday the 15th of September, parks were flooded by rain. But then as we move down, March 1852, Friday the 26th, Mr. McDougall at Raasay to meet the Ferns people to take the statements of those that wish emigration. Saturday the 27th, a large packet of shoes arrived for emigrants. April, Monday the 5th, Mr. MacDonald, the factor, to meet with the intended emigrants, and then a few days later to prepare their paperwork. And then through that month there are references to vaccinating the emigrants, to distributing clothes for them. And then when we come to June 1852, Wednesday the 7th, widow Flora MacLeod with her 3 sons and 2 daughters left Raasay for Isla's ship for Glasgow for emigration to Australia. Wednesday the 16th, sheep belonging to the Raasay emigrants and from tenants leaving the island, collected by Daniel Campbell and sold to Mr. Reid, so their livestock is being distributed. Thursday the 18th, yacht at Portree with a letter respecting the emigrants. Friday the 19th, the emigrants received their outfits today. And then June the 23rd, 1852, 12 families in all, 79 souls left Raasay on the Cygnet, stopped for Glasgow as emigrants to Australia. The Cygnet came into the bay at 2:30 p.m. In 15 minutes the emigrants were all on board. George Rainey is remembered for a couple of things. He's remembered for that rule about tenants not being allowed to marry, and also for being a major recipient of compensation when slave ownership was abolished in 1833. He also oversaw that period of huge numbers of people leaving. But it's interesting to read this different view of evidence given by the late estate factor Mr. A.E. Stewart as evidence to a later royal commission. And this is the factor writing some years later, and he says the estate of Raasay extends to about 18,000 acres. Prior to 1843 it was occupied for centuries by the family of the MacLeods of Raasay, but in that year it was placed under trustees from whom Mr. George Rainey bought it in 1846, paying £27,660 for it. The population was then between 1,000 and 1,100, chiefly crofting and cotters. In that same year, the failure of the potatoes and the partial failure of the local fishing reduced the people to the verge of starvation, and relief committees had to be appointed to provide food. Mr. Rainey undertook general estate improvements to give the people work, and to those who wished to emigrate he gave a great deal of help. He carried on improvements until his death in 1863, and his son being a minor, most of the work was then stopped by the trustees. It goes on to describe how the estate passed through the Rainey family, through various other owners, and then on to the woods. So when we pick it up again, it says, sorry Mary, I'm laughing at your message coming in. The population at the time was 650. In 1881 the population was 707. In 1891 it was 678. This increase had been due to the introduction of extra farm servants and tradesmen, a good deal of whom left after Mr. Woods died in 1886. As soon as he entered on possession, Mr. Wood gave full employment to all the people in Raasay in the work of planting, road making, trenching, draining, fencing, and he took a great deal of interest in his crofters, cotters and tenants, and bought new houses for them. And he describes during that time period building some new houses for some of the tenants. So we've come through that church ownership, and then through the MacLeod period, through Rainey, and then through some subsequent estate owners. Now in 1911 the estate was sold by Mrs. Wood to a company, William Baird and Co, ironmasters of Coatbridge, and they set about developing a mining business in Raasay to extract and sell the iron ore from the deposits which could be found in Raasay. A double-edged sword anytime you have an industry like this, because there is, of course, along with the destruction or the huge implications for the landscape, there comes the prospect of long-term employment in mining and all those associated fields. And work started in 1912 on a new housing development for miners at Inverarish. And if you're in Raasay, apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. In addition to those new houses, there was, of course, a huge amount of infrastructure that had to be built to go alongside this, in the form of miles of narrow gauge railway, a pier, a crusher, offices, power generating sheds, and some enormous kilns, 5 enormous kilns, for calcinating the ore that was being extracted. So it goes from being that kind of rural agricultural landscape to becoming this industrial landscape. And during World War I, as so many of our records show, and I've talked about so many times, there was of course a huge shortage of men as men went off to fight on the front, and Raasay was no different. There was a huge shortage of men as they went off to serve their country, and this resulted in German prisoners of war being drafted in to keep the Raasay mines running from 1916 onwards, and they were managed by Bairds on behalf of the Ministry of Munitions. And it's interesting, that seems to be in direct contravention of the Hague Convention, because the Hague Convention specifically banned prisoners of war from working on munition production. In 1920, the government attempted to destroy the records of evidence for this, and very few of them survive. At its peak, there were 260 prisoners in Raasay, 60 people from across the British Isles, and 20 locals employed in that industry. Catherine described it like this. The 2 blocks of Inverarish Terrace were enclosed in barbed wire fencing in order to house the prisoners of war, with 2 guard platforms based outside at opposite corners. The other 2 blocks housed other mine workers along with local Raasay residents. Prisoner accommodation surrounded by tall barbed wire fences with guard platforms and powerful lights. The Foreign Office report in 1917 mentioned an outbreak of scurvy at the Raasay POW camp. According to the valuation rolls of 1917 to 1918 of the buildings outside the prisoner camp, of the buildings that were built outside the camp, number 46 and 47 were guards' accommodation. One of the prisoners of war was an accomplished musician who had been the first violinist in the Kaiser's orchestra, playing concerts for the mining engineers. Many wooden toys, including simple mechanical toys, were made by the prisoners and given to local children. A conflict occurred at the end of 1917 when local workers went on strike complaining of low wages, and it was claimed in newspapers that the prisoners were used as the strike breakers. The dispute was settled by early 1918, and the prisoners and employees continued to work together until their prisoners of war returned home at the end of the war the following year. In the police records that we hold across all of our archive centres and the ones that we hold in Skye and Lochailsh, there's evidence again of this community in action. So for instance, there's a reference to the fatal accident which killed Paul Sazinka in December 1918 when a mine roof collapsed. There's a gravestone marking some of the lives lost, carved by one of the prisoners, which stands outside the cemetery there. And I know, Jen, that you're probably adding that now to your list when you come from Australia of places you want to go and see. I'd imagine that will be another memorial to lives lost that you might be interested in. At the end of World War I, 12 of the prisoners of war died of the Spanish flu very shortly before they were due to return home. As those prisoners of war were being sent home at the end of World War I, of course, British troops were also being returned, and they were returning to that very famous or infamous promise of homes fit for heroes. Many had fought on the understanding, particularly from this part of the world, had fought on the understanding that they would be rewarded with land for their service. David Lloyd George had famously said that people would be rewarded with 4 acres and a cow for their efforts. In reality, many of those returned to find that there was no place for them. Either often there was no land or no houses, and probably the biggest thing that they found, that they had left hardship and difficulty to serve their country, and when they had returned, they found their families in exactly the same struggles that they had had before. And that promise of a future and something to look forward to and change that would come simply didn't materialise despite the huge sacrifices that they had made. And across the country, protests started to happen, land raids, where the returning troops tried to claim the land that they felt had been promised to them. In 1919, the Land Settlement Act was passed because of this situation. To simplify it, basically this meant that the Board of Agriculture could compulsorily purchase land, and also they could other landowners were obliged to create small holdings for tenants. They were also often gave priority to ex-servicemen. So this is obviously an important step. It's a huge piece of legislation in Scottish history that we don't really talk about very much. A huge turning point. And it did happen in 1919, 1920, 1921. There were bits of land across Skye and Raasay and other areas that were allocated for this use, but it took far longer to implement than expected, and frustrations, which were already high after the war, were becoming more and more raised. And in 1921, 7 men left the Isle of Rona for Raasay, Isle of Rona being very nearby. They were in Rona because their families had been cleared from Raasay to Rona previously. They left to go to Raasay, and the aim of these men, who became known as the Raasay Raiders, was to claim the land that they had been promised. And here's how it was recorded in the Daily Herald and other newspapers at the time. The headline is "Armistice Day in Jail. Ex-servicemen who raided the land." A number of ex-servicemen in Scotland will spend Armistice Day in prison for asserting the right to cultivate the land they fought for. They had seized land on the island of Raasay, which was let to an English sporting tenant by the landlords, Messrs Baird & Co., the well-known Glasgow ironmasters. Strong protests are being made against their treatment at Scottish meetings. These men, with their families, lived on the island of Rona, to which their forefathers had been driven by the clearance of the adjacent fertile island of Raasay. Rona has long been overcrowded, and the people on this island lived in conditions unfit for human beings. Despite this treatment, all the available men in Rona served in the war. When they returned, they found the same old conditions. Every effort to obtain land by legal method failed, and at last, in desperation, a number of the Rona men and their families crossed to Raasay and settled at the south end of the island. Here they cultivated patches of the game run for food and erected rough houses for their families. They were, and are prepared to, pay rent. The landlords, with the consent of the government, secured an interdict, and for disobeying this, the men have now been sent to Inverness prison to undergo a sentence of 21 days. On arrival at Inverness station on Wednesday, they received a warm welcome. Memorials for those men that died prison for those men that didn't. Quite a powerful last sentence, particularly. The case created a national outcry. They were treated sympathetically in prison, and the national feeling was very much on the side of the Raasay raiders. They were released in December 1921, and they were each given a croft in Raasay, where many of their descendants remain. And Joanna, I'm seeing you saying that your husband's great-grandfather was one of those men. By 1922, the Board of Agriculture had purchased large swathes of Raasay from Baird's. The mining plant that Baird's had run there was gradually dismantled and largely dismantled by 1943. From 1961 onwards, the department sold off parts of the estate, and in 1979, the Highlands and Islands Development Board, which later became Highlands and Islands Enterprise, bought part of that estate, and that part is now in community ownership since 2007. I think you'll agree that for a small place, Raasay has a huge amount of stories. Numerous stories of hardship, of struggle, of good times, of bad times. A fascinating place, and one which created one of our great national figures, one of our great national cultural icons, Sorley MacLean. And I'm aware I've barely touched on Sorley MacLean, and that's because I think he merits a whole separate episode, which I will do in the new year. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm astonished I've been able to keep that to half an hour. You'll all be astonished. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at the history of the Northern Meeting, a very interesting organisation that was formed in the 1700s and is still going strong today. This series, as you will be well aware, is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that, as there is no charge or subscription required to take part. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your lovely messages. I'm seeing them all coming in. Thank you.